Going over the cliff would give lawmakers both the opportunity to enact a budget deal because they would have more revenues and less spending already in the baseline, and it gives them the incentive to enact a budget deal because they won't like the structure of taxes and they won't like the structure of spending.
This is At Brookings, a weekly, in-depth look at issues behind the news. This week, tax cuts, tax reform, and the fiscal cliff.
The political battle over whether to extend the Bush-era tax cuts goes on, and the U.S. may be in store for more economic hardship next year. If Congress fails to act, the so-called fiscal cliff of automatic spending cuts will kick in, and the tax cuts may expire for both the rich and the middle class. That may not necessarily be all bad, notes senior fellow Bill Gale. Bill, we're hearing a lot of talk now about the so-called fiscal cliff. Are we in danger of falling over? And if we do, would it be a bad thing?
If Congress does nothing right now, we will get tax increases and spending cuts effective at the end of this year. That is likely to hurt the economy in the short run, but it would put the economy on a better long-term budget path. It's a good path for the overall fiscal stance of the country. That is, it cuts deficits. It would get the debt to GDP ratio to start coming down, but many people on both sides wouldn't like the structure of taxes or the structure of spending under that scenario.
So there is the tax side of it and then the spending side. Explain it, if you would.
On the tax side, the problem is that going over the cliff would raise tax rates, and what most people, myself included, would like to see us do is reduce the use of loopholes and raise revenue from expanding the base rather than raising rates. On the spending side, the issue is that the sequester applies to discretionary spending, whereas the real issues on the spending side are entitlement spending.
Well, what would you recommend? What would be the best thing we could do right now?
What I would like to see is the whole tax debate get away from the Bush tax cuts and let them expire and talk about other issues. There are better ways to stimulate the economy than the Bush tax cuts. CBO ranked the Bush tax cuts 11 out of 11 different options in terms of bang for the buck and stimulating the economy. And so something like a payroll tax would have a much bigger stimulative effect, even if it was the same size as a one-year extension of the Bush tax cuts. So what I would like to see us do is combine a temporary fiscal stimulus with the idea that we go over the fiscal cliff and let the Bush tax cuts expire.
Well, let's talk about some of the ideas that are being discussed to address these issues.
What the administration wants to do is extend all the tax cuts for people with income $250,000 and lower, and not extend the tax cuts that only apply to people with income above that. Now, people with income above $250,000, and this is not generally well understood, but people with income above $250,000 would still get tax cuts from Obama's proposal. They just wouldn't get all of the tax cuts that they would get if the top two rates were to stay low. What the Republicans want to do is extend the Bush tax cuts for all taxpayers. What Obama wants to do is extend them for the group with the bottom 95% or so. The interesting political battle is whether those two things will be voted on separately or as one package. The Republicans want to vote on one package because they don't want to decouple tax cuts for the high-income groups from tax cuts for everyone else. The Democrats want to take separate votes because they say, well, everyone agrees on the tax cuts for $250,000 and lower, so let's pass that. Let's not hold the middle class hostage, and then let's have a debate about the upper income.
Is it likely that we'll fall into a recession next year if action isn't taken?
Well, the likelihood of recession next year depends critically on what policymakers choose to do in the next 6 months and the next 12 months. CBO predicts 2 negative quarters of economic activity, and then that the economy would rebound after that. Given how weak the economy is right now, that's not a great thing. And we can and should avoid that if we can. But the way to do it, in my view, is with a temporary stimulus package that involves, say, payroll tax cuts, perhaps government spending on infrastructure and aid to the states, rather than extending the Bush tax cuts. All the analysis show that the payroll tax cut, infrastructure and aid to the states would give a bigger bang for the buck than extending the Bush tax cuts.
Well, should we be optimistic about a solid plan going forward?
The important thing is to control the things that we actually can. For example, whether we stimulate and whether we get on a good long-term budget path. And we have an opportunity to do both right now. Whether policymakers take that opportunity is a more complicated political issue.
Stay up to date with the latest research, learn about Brookings events, and search our directory of experts. All from your mobile device. To download Brookings for your BlackBerry, Android, iPhone, or iPad, go to brookings.edu/mobile.